Welcome to Luxurious Tales. If you love powerful stories, don't forget to like, share, and comment. Subscribe to Luxurious Tales and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new tale. Listen closely. The story begins now. Amelia Wright's life had been shaped long before love ever found her, molded in a quiet household where responsibility arrived early and excuses were never welcomed. She grew up in a modest suburb in the United States, raised by her widowed mother, Teresa Wright, whose strength was expressed not through loud declarations but through unwavering consistency. Amelia learned early how to read a room, how to anticipate needs, how to give care without being asked. Her childhood was not deprived, but it was disciplined, meals shared at the same hour, schoolwork completed before rest, emotions acknowledged but never allowed to spiral unchecked. That structure became the backbone of Amelia's identity. Even as a young girl, she feared chaos more than hardship, and she dreamed of a life built on stability, warmth, and mutual protection. The loss of her father when she was still young carved a permanent sensitivity into Amelia's heart. She watched her mother grieve privately, never allowing sorrow to paralyze the household, and from that example Amelia learned resilience without bitterness. Her younger brother, Evan Wright, became both her responsibility and her refuge. Amelia took pride in being dependable, helping Evan with school, ensuring Teresa never felt alone, keeping the household running with calm precision. Yet beneath that composure lived quiet fears she never voiced aloud, the fear of abandonment, the fear of loving deeply and losing everything suddenly, the fear that loyalty might one day be mistaken for weakness. Still, her moral compass remained firm. Amelia believed that love should feel safe, that commitment was sacred, and that building a family was not an obligation but a privilege earned through patience and trust. By the time Amelia reached adulthood, her routines had become rituals of reassurance. Early mornings grounded her, order soothed her thoughts, and planning for the future gave her a sense of control over an unpredictable world. She dreamed of motherhood not as a fantasy, but as a responsibility she intended to honor fully, children raised with emotional security, honesty, and consistency. Friends often described her as gentle, but those who knew her well understood that her gentleness was not fragility, it was a deliberate choice shaped by survival. Amelia did not crave attention or admiration. What she wanted was quieter and far more profound, a life where love did not arrive with conditions, where loyalty was not transactional, and where the storms of life could be weathered together rather than alone. She had no way of knowing that the very values she cherished would soon be tested in ways she could never have imagined. Julian Cross grew up in a house where approval was scarce and expectations were heavy, shaped largely by his strained relationship with his father, Robert Cross. Robert believed success was the only proof of worth, and he enforced that belief with relentless comparisons to other men who seemed to have achieved more, faster. Julian learned early that being average was unforgivable. Every shortcoming was magnified, every delay treated as failure. Though he possessed natural charm and intelligence, Julian's childhood was marked by a constant hunger to prove himself. He did not simply want comfort, he wanted recognition. Praise, when it came, felt intoxicating, and when it didn't, resentment brewed quietly beneath his polished exterior. As Julian grew older, his ambition sharpened into obsession. He measured his value against the achievements of others, growing restless whenever someone advanced ahead of him. Financial limitations frustrated him deeply, not because he lacked necessities, but because he equated money with respect and power. He cultivated an image of confidence, speaking with conviction and dressing with precision, but internally he felt perpetually behind. His friendships reflected this duality. Miles Horton, his closest friend, admired Julian's drive yet often sensed the moral shortcuts Julian was willing to consider. Miles believed in progress earned steadily, while Julian believed success justified risk. Their conversations were filled with debates about ambition, loyalty, and what one owed to others while climbing upward. Despite his outward charisma, Julian carried an emptiness he rarely acknowledged. He wanted admiration without vulnerability, love without accountability, and partnership without sacrifice. His inner restlessness made him impatient with anything that threatened to slow him down, including emotional dependence. While others found contentment in steady routines, Julian felt suffocated by them. He dreamed of a life where his name commanded attention, where his choices went unquestioned, and where he never again had to feel small in his father's shadow. That hunger for significance would quietly guide his decisions, shaping not only his future but the lives of those who trusted him most, long before he understood the cost of placing ambition above humanity. Amelia and Julian met in a way that felt almost unremarkable at first, through overlapping social circles that gathered around community events and shared acquaintances. Their initial conversations were polite, cautious, and surprisingly easy, the kind that unfolded without effort but also without urgency. Amelia noticed Julian's confidence immediately, how he spoke as though he already belonged in every room he entered. Julian, in turn, was drawn to Amelia's calm presence, the steadiness in her voice, the way she listened fully before responding. There was no dramatic spark, no instant declaration of destiny, but there was curiosity, and that curiosity kept pulling them back into each other's orbit. As their interactions increased, so did the contrasts between them. Amelia valued depth and consistency, often asking thoughtful questions about Julian's experiences and beliefs. Julian enjoyed the attention, mistaking her genuine interest for admiration, and he found comfort in how she seemed to ground him without demanding anything in return. Subtle red flags appeared, though Amelia didn't yet recognize them as such: Julian's tendency to redirect conversations toward his ambitions, his discomfort whenever vulnerability surfaced, his subtle need to be affirmed. Still, he was attentive in ways that felt sincere, and Amelia interpreted his intensity as passion rather than restlessness. Their connection grew slowly, layered with moments of warmth and quiet understanding. Amelia believed in building trust over time, and she appreciated that Julian seemed willing to meet her halfway. Julian, on the other hand, felt validated by her presence, enjoying how her composure softened his edges without challenging his worldview. Beneath the surface, two very different motivations were forming. Amelia was falling in love with the idea of partnership, of shared growth and mutual care. Julian was falling in love with how she made him feel, seen, respected, and temporarily relieved of his constant sense of inadequacy. Neither of them fully understood the imbalance taking shape, and in that unawareness, the foundation of something both beautiful and dangerous was quietly being laid. Dating transformed Amelia and Julian's connection into something more visible, more demanding, and far more revealing. Their time together was filled with carefully planned outings and long conversations that stretched late into the night. Julian presented himself as attentive and driven, someone with clear goals and strong opinions, and Amelia admired what she believed was his sense of purpose. Yet beneath the affection, subtle negotiations began to shape their relationship. Julian expected admiration and reassurance, while Amelia offered patience and understanding, often setting aside her own discomfort to preserve harmony. Disagreements were smoothed over quickly, not resolved, and passion frequently replaced honest confrontation. As Amelia invested more emotionally, she found herself adjusting, rearranging her routines, prioritizing Julian's needs, and rationalizing moments that left her unsettled. Julian thrived in this dynamic, interpreting her adaptability as devotion rather than compromise. It was during this period that Clara Bennett entered the periphery of Julian's life. An ambitious colleague with sharp instincts, Clara observed Julian closely, recognizing both his hunger for validation and his growing dissatisfaction. She did not intervene openly, but her presence lingered quietly, calculated and patient, noting the cracks that Amelia tried to ignore. Amelia's relationship with Julian's family added another layer of complexity. Daphne Cross, Julian's mother, was courteous on the surface but deeply critical beneath polite smiles. She questioned Amelia's choices subtly, framing concerns as advice while reinforcing Julian's sense of superiority. Amelia, eager to belong, endured these interactions with grace, believing that patience would eventually earn acceptance. Julian rarely defended her, brushing off his mother's behavior as harmless. In those moments, Amelia felt a faint sting of disappointment she could not yet name. Love, she told herself, required endurance. She did not realize that endurance without boundaries would soon become the quiet condition upon which her place in Julian's life depended. Their wedding was elegant without being extravagant, a carefully curated celebration that reflected more intention than excess. Amelia approached marriage with reverence, believing it marked the beginning of a shared responsibility rather than a personal achievement. She poured her energy into planning a life that felt stable and nurturing, imagining evenings filled with mutual respect and long-term goals shaped together. Julian, standing beside her at the altar, felt pride more than promise. To him, marriage symbolized arrival, proof that he was progressing, building the life expected of him. Their vows sounded harmonious, but even then, their interpretations of commitment quietly diverged. The early days of marriage revealed those differences with increasing clarity. Financial pressures surfaced, not because of scarcity, but because of expectations. Julian resented any reminder of limitation, growing irritated when plans required patience. Amelia compensated instinctively, managing household responsibilities with precision and emotional care. She became the steady center around which everything revolved, absorbing stress and smoothing conflicts before they could escalate. Julian, meanwhile, felt constrained by the predictability of married life. He loved the support Amelia provided but resisted the accountability that came with partnership, interpreting compromise as restriction rather than collaboration. Social gatherings exposed the imbalance further. Family dinners and neighborhood interactions placed Amelia in the role of emotional anchor, while Julian gravitated toward conversations that reinforced his aspirations. Subtle humiliations emerged, dismissive comments framed as jokes, moments where Amelia's contributions were minimized or overlooked. She noticed them but chose silence, believing harmony was worth the sacrifice. Julian mistook her restraint for contentment. As their routine solidified, so did the uneven ground beneath them. Amelia believed she was building a foundation strong enough to withstand future storms. Julian, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge the cracks, was already beginning to feel trapped by the very structures she worked so hard to maintain. Amelia discovered she was pregnant on a quiet morning that felt deceptively ordinary, the kind of day that carried no warning of how profoundly life was about to shift. The realization filled her with a cautious joy, layered with responsibility rather than fantasy. She imagined the careful planning required, the routine she would create, the stability she wanted to offer her child. When she shared the news with Julian, she watched his face closely, hoping to see shared excitement. What she found instead was hesitation disguised as a smile, a pause that lingered just long enough to unsettle her before he forced congratulations that sounded practiced rather than instinctive. Julian's reaction grew more complex as the days passed. He spoke of timing, finances, and expectations, framing his concerns as practicality while masking a deeper fear of responsibility. The idea of being needed unsettled him, challenging his sense of control and forward momentum. Amelia tried to reassure him, emphasizing partnership and shared effort, believing that love would bridge the uncertainty. She scheduled her first medical appointment with careful optimism, determined to approach pregnancy with the same discipline she applied to every major commitment in her life. Yet beneath her calm, unease began to take root. The appointment introduced Dr. Samuel Brooks, a composed and attentive obstetrician who approached Amelia's care with seriousness and empathy. Early examinations revealed concerns that required monitoring, nothing conclusive but enough to shift the tone from celebration to caution. Amelia absorbed the information quietly, determined not to panic, while Julian grew distant, overwhelmed by implications he did not want to confront. The pregnancy, once an abstract possibility, became real in ways Julian could not ignore. For Amelia, it strengthened her resolve. For Julian, it planted the first seeds of resentment, an unspoken sense that the life growing inside her was already demanding more than he was prepared to give. As Amelia's pregnancy progressed, the subtle fractures in her marriage began to widen into visible gaps. Julian immersed himself in work-related commitments, staying out later and returning home with explanations that sounded rehearsed rather than sincere. His mind seemed elsewhere, his attention divided, and when Amelia attempted to share her worries about her health, he responded with impatience masked as reassurance. She noticed how conversations that once flowed easily now felt strained, punctuated by silences he no longer tried to fill. Amelia told herself it was stress, a temporary imbalance that commitment would eventually correct. Physically, the pregnancy demanded more from Amelia than she had anticipated. Fatigue weighed heavily on her, and bouts of dizziness forced her to slow down in ways she found frustrating. Dr. Brooks advised caution, encouraging rest and careful monitoring. Amelia followed every instruction diligently, determined to protect her unborn child. Family interference increased as well. Teresa worried openly, urging Amelia to prioritize her health, while Daphne cross-framed concern as criticism, subtly implying that Amelia's condition was an inconvenience. Julian rarely intervened, allowing his mother's comments to stand, which deepened Amelia's sense of isolation. During this period, Clara Bennett's presence grew more pronounced in Julian's daily life. She positioned herself as understanding and supportive, offering sympathy without demands, admiration without accountability. Julian found relief in her attention, mistaking ease for compatibility. While Amelia struggled to maintain emotional connection at home, Julian found escape elsewhere, rationalizing his distance as necessary focus. Amelia sensed a shift she could not fully explain, an undercurrent of change that made her anxious without providing clarity. The cracks were no longer hidden. They stretched quietly across the foundation of their marriage, threatening stability in ways Amelia could feel but not yet confront. Julian crossed a line he had been approaching for months, though he would later insist it happened gradually, almost without intention. His connection with Clara Bennett shifted from professional proximity into something deliberately hidden, built on shared grievances and unspoken desire. Clara understood how to frame her attention as refuge, how to listen without challenging him, how to admire his ambitions without questioning the cost. Their conversations became private, then protected, then guarded with lies. Julian told himself it was temporary, a harmless distraction, refusing to name it for what it was. Each secret exchange deepened the separation between the man he appeared to be at home and the one he was becoming elsewhere. At home, Amelia felt the atmosphere change even though no proof surfaced to confirm her unease. Julian's affection grew inconsistent, sometimes excessive, sometimes absent, leaving her emotionally disoriented. She noticed how he shielded his phone, how his patience thinned when she asked about his day, how his apologies came too quickly and without substance. Still, Amelia trusted love more than instinct. She believed that confronting suspicion without evidence would only fracture what she was trying so desperately to hold together. Instead, she focused inward, clinging to routine and discipline, convincing herself that stability would eventually draw him back. Miles Horton watched these changes with growing discomfort. He sensed the moral shift in Julian, the ease with which truth was now bent to preserve convenience. Though he never witnessed the affair directly, the patterns unsettled him, the secrecy, the justifications, the emotional detachment. Miles considered speaking up but hesitated, torn between loyalty and conscience. Clara, meanwhile, began to reveal her deeper motives, subtly encouraging Julian's dissatisfaction with his marriage and framing Amelia's pregnancy as an obstacle rather than a responsibility. Secrets no longer whispered, they began to breathe, expanding quietly, shaping choices, and setting the stage for consequences no one yet fully understood. The first emergency came without warning, turning an ordinary evening into a blur of fear and urgency. Amelia collapsed at home after a sudden wave of pain and dizziness that left her disoriented and breathless. Teresa's voice trembled as she called for help, and within minutes, flashing lights and hurried voices filled the space Amelia had tried so hard to keep calm and orderly. At the hospital, sterile corridors and sharp smells replaced familiarity as nurses moved with practiced urgency. Amelia's thoughts drifted between fear for her unborn child and the desperate hope that Julian would arrive, that his presence alone might steady her racing heart. Julian did not come. His absence echoed louder than any alarm, settling heavily in Amelia's chest as she lay under harsh lights, surrounded by strangers monitoring her fragile condition. While doctors worked to stabilize her, Julian was elsewhere, offering Clara updates framed as inconvenience rather than crisis. Clara responded with concern carefully measured, positioning herself as supportive without ever encouraging him to return home. Amelia survived the night, but the experience left her shaken, acutely aware of how vulnerable she truly was. When Julian finally called hours later, his voice lacked urgency, and the distance between them widened irreversibly. Dr. Samuel Brooks met Amelia the following morning with honesty that carried both caution and resolve. He explained that her pregnancy showed signs of complications requiring close observation and lifestyle adjustments. Stress, he warned, could worsen her condition significantly. Amelia listened attentively, absorbing every word, determined to follow instructions precisely. Though physically exhausted, her mind remained alert, cataloging details, planning next steps. Yet beneath her composed exterior, something fundamental had shifted. The hospital lights had illuminated a truth she could no longer ignore. In moments when she needed Julian most, his absence was not accidental, it was a choice. After Amelia's discharge, Julian's emotional withdrawal hardened into something deliberate. He moved through their shared space with mechanical politeness, offering help only when it was expected and avoiding conversations that required presence. He no longer asked about her health unless prompted, and when she spoke of follow-up appointments or lingering pain, his responses were clipped, pragmatic, and distant. Inside him, a decision had already been made. He told himself that detachment was necessary, that clarity required distance, and that prolonging uncertainty would only complicate things. In truth, he was severing emotional ties quietly, rehearsing an exit while maintaining the appearance of normalcy. Daphne Cross noticed the shift immediately and encouraged it with subtle approval. In private conversations, she framed Amelia's condition as instability, a liability that threatened Julian's trajectory. She spoke of freedom, of reclaiming focus, of avoiding a future weighed down by obligation. Julian absorbed her words eagerly, grateful for validation that framed his growing indifference as wisdom rather than cruelty. At the same time, Clara intensified her influence, pushing for exclusivity with carefully chosen language that disguised pressure as support. She suggested timelines, hinted at possibilities, and spoke as though Amelia were already a chapter Julian was meant to outgrow. Amelia sensed none of the planning unfolding around her. She interpreted Julian's distance as stress, believing patience would restore balance. She focused on recovery, following Dr. Brooks's instructions meticulously, tracking symptoms, and maintaining routines that gave her comfort. In moments of quiet, she placed her hands over her abdomen and spoke softly, promising safety and consistency to the life growing inside her. Though unease lingered, she refused to imagine betrayal, convinced that commitment meant enduring uncertainty together. Unaware of the line Julian had crossed internally, Amelia remained anchored in faith, believing that love, once chosen, could not be abandoned without warning. The second trimester arrived not with relief, but with revelations that shifted the emotional gravity of Amelia's world. During a routine scan meant to assess stability, Dr. Samuel Brooks studied the monitor longer than usual before explaining, with careful precision, that Amelia was carrying twins, a boy and a girl. The news landed with a mix of wonder and apprehension. Amelia's heart swelled at the thought of two lives, two futures intertwined, even as the implications deepened her concern. Dr. Brooks outlined stricter precautions, emphasizing that a twin pregnancy elevated every existing risk. Amelia nodded steadily, absorbing the information with resolve rather than fear. When Amelia shared the news with Julian, his reaction was unmistakably restrained. There was no shared joy, no curiosity, no instinctive reach toward connection. He acknowledged the twins with a brief response that felt procedural, as though the revelation complicated an already burdensome equation. His questions focused on logistics rather than life, costs, schedules, constraints, while Amelia spoke of names she hadn't chosen yet, of hopes she dared not voice fully. The emotional gap widened into a chasm. Clara, upon learning of the twins indirectly, interpreted the development as a threat to her imagined future and intensified her quiet campaign to reposition herself as Julian's priority. Amelia was placed on partial bed rest soon after, her days narrowing into measured routines governed by medical guidance. She adapted with discipline, transforming stillness into structure, documenting symptoms, timing meals, and maintaining calm for the sake of her children. Teresa became a steady presence, while Evan offered support in small, sincere gestures that reminded Amelia she was not alone. At night, when the house grew quiet, Amelia felt the weight of uncertainty settle heavily. Joy and fear coexisted uneasily, and though she sensed Julian drifting further away, she anchored herself to purpose. The storm had arrived, not just within her body, but within the fragile architecture of her marriage. Julian's resolve hardened in silence, shaped by late nights and private calculations that excluded empathy entirely. He began consulting legal counsel discreetly, framing his inquiries around options and protection, language that allowed him to distance himself from the human cost of his intentions. Documents were drafted, revised, and hidden, each page reducing his marriage to clauses and contingencies. He justified the secrecy as efficiency, convincing himself that confrontation would only invite chaos. In his mind, decisive action equaled strength. The thought that Amelia was carrying twins, fragile lives depending on stability, was compartmentalized, acknowledged only as a complication to be managed rather than a responsibility to honor. Clara's influence grew sharper and more directive during this period. She encouraged Julian to act swiftly, framing delay as weakness and compassion as hesitation that could cost him momentum. She spoke of fresh starts and unencumbered futures, subtly implying that Amelia's condition would only worsen, tying him to circumstances beyond his control. Daphne Cross reinforced the narrative with maternal authority, praising Julian's clarity and cautioning against sentimentality. Together, they constructed an echo chamber where abandonment sounded reasonable and cruelty was reframed as necessity. Julian absorbed it all, mistaking validation for wisdom and allowing resentment to eclipse any remaining sense of duty. Meanwhile, Amelia felt a growing tension she could not explain. Her body demanded rest, yet her instincts remained alert, attuned to shifts in tone and timing. Julian's absences lengthened, his explanations thinning into vague assurances that offered no comfort. She sensed danger without shape, a looming presence she could neither see nor name. Still, she clung to structure, medical appointments, careful nutrition, measured breathing, believing preparation could guard against the unknown. Amelia did not know that the decision had already been made, that plans were moving forward without her consent, and that the life she was fighting to protect was about to face its most severe test. The emergency unfolded with terrifying speed, collapsing time into a series of urgent commands and flashing lights. Amelia was rushed to the hospital after a sudden deterioration that left her gasping, her body trembling as pain radiated through her abdomen. Monitors beeped in sharp, irregular rhythms while nurses moved with swift precision, stabilizing her as Dr. Samuel Brooks coordinated interventions with measured authority. The room filled with sterile brightness, every surface reflecting the gravity of the moment. Amelia drifted in and out of awareness, her thoughts tethered to one desperate refrain, that her babies must live, that she must hold on long enough to protect them. Julian arrived after the situation had escalated, his presence strikingly out of place against the urgency surrounding Amelia's bed. He did not reach for her hand or ask about her condition. Instead, he stood rigidly, eyes fixed on paperwork he carried like a shield. When he spoke, his words cut through the room with chilling clarity, announcing his intention to proceed with divorce. The timing shattered any remaining illusion of humanity. Nurses paused, witnesses frozen by disbelief, while Amelia struggled to process the cruelty through pain and fear. Dr. Brooks intervened immediately, demanding focus on medical survival, his voice firm with restrained outrage. As Julian placed the documents on the bedside table, something irrevocable broke. Amelia's strength faltered not from physical strain alone, but from the emotional devastation that surged through her. The room felt suddenly smaller, heavier, as though the walls themselves recoiled from the act. Julian justified himself in clipped sentences, citing inevitability and clarity, but no explanation could soften the violence of abandonment in that moment. The moral line had been crossed, unmistakably and publicly. As Amelia was moved toward intensive care, the papers remained behind, symbolic remnants of a choice that would echo far beyond the hospital walls, altering every life it touched. The aftermath of Julian's actions rippled through the hospital with a force no one could ignore. Medical staff whispered in hallways, their professionalism strained by disbelief at what they had witnessed. Nurses who had tended to Amelia with quiet compassion now regarded Julian with thinly veiled contempt. Dr. Samuel Brooks documented everything meticulously, ensuring that the incident was recorded not as hearsay but as fact, his calm demeanor masking deep moral outrage. Amelia, unconscious and suspended between life and death, became the silent center of a storm she could not yet comprehend, while the weight of Julian's decision began to settle heavily on everyone who had seen it unfold. Miles Horton arrived later that night after hearing fragmented reports that did not fully capture the severity of the situation. When he learned what Julian had done, something in him finally fractured. Loyalty gave way to conscience. He spoke openly with hospital administrators and legal representatives, confirming details Julian had hoped would remain obscured. The story began to circulate beyond the hospital walls, not as gossip but as a chilling account of abandonment at the most vulnerable moment imaginable. Julian, sensing the shift, attempted to justify himself to those who would listen, but his explanations rang hollow, stripped of credibility by the setting and timing of his actions. Outside the hospital, consequences began forming quietly but relentlessly. Legal professionals questioned the wisdom of Julian's approach, warning of implications he had underestimated. Professional relationships cooled as colleagues distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with a narrative so publicly callous. Daphne's attempts to control damage through selective communication failed as truth traveled faster than strategy. Clara, watching the fallout unfold, realized that the certainty she had promised herself was far less secure than she imagined. As Amelia remained unconscious in intensive care, the cost of cruelty revealed itself, not as immediate punishment, but as the slow, irreversible erosion of everything Julian believed he controlled. Truth surfaced first in fragments, then in patterns too consistent to dismiss. What began as quiet questions from legal counsel expanded into a review of Julian's recent decisions, accounts opened without transparency, obligations deferred, representations made that no longer aligned with reality. Colleagues who had once praised his decisiveness now scrutinized his methods, noticing inconsistencies they had previously overlooked. Miles Horton, compelled by conscience, provided context that clarified intent and timing, outlining how Julian's choices had accelerated in lockstep with his personal entanglements. The narrative shifted from a private marital dispute to a broader examination of judgment, ethics, and risk. Clara Bennett's role emerged under closer examination, not through accusation but through corroboration. Messages and timelines revealed a pattern of influence that reframed her earlier discretion as strategy. She had positioned herself as indispensable while isolating Julian from dissenting voices, encouraging speed where caution was warranted and framing abandonment as efficiency. As scrutiny intensified, Clara's confidence wavered, her assurances of certainty dissolved under pressure she had never intended to face. Daphne Cross's involvement, once dismissed as maternal interference, now appeared calculated, her guidance consistently steering Julian toward choices that favored control over compassion, advancement over accountability. Investigations began quietly, deliberately, avoiding spectacle but leaving no corner unexamined. Advisors withdrew, partnerships paused, and allies recalibrated their distance. Julian felt the ground shift beneath him as explanations failed to restore trust. Each attempt to assert authority revealed further fragility, each defense exposing deeper inconsistencies. The truth refused containment, expanding beyond what strategy could manage. As Amelia remained in critical care, unaware of the unraveling outside her room, a different kind of inevitability took hold, one not born of ambition, but of consequence, steadily aligning facts with accountability. The decision was made in a narrow window of time measured by alarms and urgent exchanges, when hesitation carried risks no one was willing to accept. Dr. Samuel Brooks convened the team with calm authority, outlining the necessity of an emergency delivery while Amelia's condition teetered on a fragile edge. The room transformed into a choreography of precision, monitors calibrated, instruments prepared, voices lowered to focus. Amelia was unconscious, her body bearing the strain of weeks of complication compressed into a single, perilous moment. Every professional present understood the stakes, 2 lives waiting to arrive, 1 life fighting to remain. The delivery unfolded under intense vigilance, each step executed with deliberate care. A boy emerged first, small and resilient, his arrival met with swift assessments and steady hands. Moments later, a girl followed, her presence fragile yet determined. The twins were stabilized immediately, their care coordinated seamlessly as the team balanced urgency with restraint. Dr. Brooks oversaw every decision, ensuring protocols were followed without haste. The atmosphere remained taut, suspended between relief and vigilance, as Amelia's condition demanded continued intervention even after the babies were safely transferred to specialized care. Hours later, the unit settled into a measured quiet, the kind that follows profound exertion. Amelia remained in recovery, her survival uncertain but no longer slipping away. The twins rested under watchful observation, their futures tentative yet possible. Teresa stood at the threshold of the ward, absorbing the gravity of what had occurred, offering gratitude without spectacle. News traveled cautiously, good where it could be, guarded where it must. In that space between exhaustion and hope, life asserted itself not with celebration, but with resolve, marking a turning point forged not by choice, but by endurance. The consequences Julian had dismissed as manageable began arriving with an efficiency he could neither negotiate nor outrun. Professional relationships dissolved first, not with confrontation but with silence, calls unreturned, meetings postponed indefinitely, access quietly revoked. Advisors who once praised his decisiveness now spoke in measured tones about exposure and risk, making it clear that his judgment had become a liability. The narrative circulating beyond the hospital no longer centered on ambition or progress, it centered on timing, cruelty, and credibility. Each door that closed did so without spectacle, leaving Julian to confront a widening isolation that no amount of justification could repair. Clara's allegiance proved conditional, evaporating under scrutiny she had never anticipated. As inquiries tightened and timelines aligned, her confidence fractured into defensiveness, then retreat. She denied influence, minimized proximity, and ultimately distanced herself, unwilling to be tethered to consequences she had helped set in motion. Daphne Cross attempted damage control through selective appeals and private reassurances, but her authority no longer carried weight. Her guidance, once framed as protective wisdom, was now recognized as a pattern of manipulation that had accelerated Julian's fall. The echo chamber that had sustained his certainty collapsed, leaving him exposed to a reality stripped of reinforcement. Legal pressures mounted steadily, each development compounding the last. Agreements were reviewed, representations challenged, and decisions reevaluated through the lens of conduct and timing. Julian discovered that power derived from position evaporates when trust erodes. Regret arrived late and without relief, offering no pathway back, only a stark accounting of loss. While Amelia lay recovering and the twins fought quietly to grow stronger, Julian faced the full weight of his choices. Karma did not arrive as spectacle or vengeance, it arrived as consequence, precise, relentless, and entirely indifferent to his explanations. Amelia woke to a quiet that felt unfamiliar, the kind that follows catastrophe rather than precedes it. The steady rhythm of machines grounded her as awareness returned in fragments, light filtering through curtains, the faint hum of activity beyond the door, the weight of exhaustion settled deep within her bones. Dr. Samuel Brooks explained what had happened with measured clarity, careful not to overwhelm her fragile state. She listened without interruption, absorbing the truth piece by piece, the emergency delivery, the twins' condition, the narrow margins that had defined survival. Emotion did not arrive as tears or panic, it arrived as stillness, a deliberate gathering of strength. Recovery demanded patience. Amelia had never practiced so deliberately. Her body required time, and her mind demanded recalibration. Teresa remained close, offering presence rather than reassurance, while Evan's visits brought quiet comfort through simple conversation and familiar humor. Nurses moved with respectful efficiency, acknowledging Amelia not as a victim but as a participant in her own healing. When Amelia finally asked about Julian, the answer was brief and factual, free of commentary. She did not ask for details. What mattered now was not understanding his choices, but reclaiming authority over her own life. As days passed, Amelia's resolve clarified into something unshakable. She chose dignity not as restraint, but as direction. She authorized protective measures without spectacle, accepted guidance where necessary, and set boundaries that required no explanation. When she was finally able to see her children, small, resilient, alive, something inside her aligned. The future was no longer theoretical, it was present, tangible, and dependent on her steadiness. Amelia did not frame survival as triumph. She framed it as responsibility. In choosing to live forward without bitterness, she marked the beginning of a strength shaped not by endurance alone, but by intention. Julian's reckoning arrived without ceremony, stripped of drama and devoid of sympathy. What remained of his professional standing collapsed under documented timelines and corroborated accounts that left little room for reinterpretation. The language of authority he once wielded now sounded hollow in formal rooms where decisions were reviewed rather than debated. Advisors spoke plainly, outlining outcomes that were no longer negotiable. Isolation settled in as a constant, replacing the validation he had once pursued so relentlessly. The realization came slowly and then all at once, every path forward now required humility he had never learned to practice, and restitution he could not reverse. Amelia, meanwhile, focused on permanence rather than reaction. With measured clarity, she secured protections that centered the twins' stability and her autonomy, making choices grounded in foresight rather than anger. She accepted support from those who showed consistency, declining overtures that arrived too late or carried conditions. The process was thorough and quiet, executed without spectacle. Amelia did not seek acknowledgement or apology, she sought certainty. Each decision reinforced boundaries that would not be crossed again, ensuring her children's future would not be vulnerable to volatility or revision. When Julian attempted contact, the response was procedural and brief, devoid of emotion yet unmistakably final. There was no confrontation to perform, no closure to negotiate. Accountability, Amelia understood, did not require dialogue, it required consequence. As Julian faced the cumulative weight of loss, Amelia advanced deliberately, anchored by responsibility rather than resentment. The ashes of what had been could not be rebuilt, nor did she wish them to be. In choosing structure over sentiment, Amelia affirmed a future defined not by what was taken from her, but by what she refused to surrender again. The transition into motherhood did not arrive as a dramatic transformation, but as a steady unfolding shaped by intention and discipline. Amelia approached her new life with the same quiet precision that had always guided her, now recalibrated to include two fragile lives entirely dependent on her steadiness. The twins, her son and daughter, grew stronger day by day, their progress measured not just in weight and milestones, but in the rhythm they brought into her world. Nights were long and demanding, yet grounded by purpose. Amelia structured her days around care, recovery, and foresight, building routines that fostered stability rather than spectacle. Around her, life reorganized itself in response to the boundaries she had set. Teresa remained a constant presence, not as a caretaker but as a partner in resilience, while Evan's role evolved into quiet support that asked nothing in return. Medical professionals continued their watchful guidance, respecting Amelia's autonomy and resolve. Conversations shifted from survival to sustainability, from crisis management to long-term planning. Amelia listened carefully, made deliberate choices, and declined paths that promised ease at the expense of certainty. Her focus remained unwavering: safety, consistency, and the preservation of a future not subject to volatility. Julian faded into consequence without ceremony, his absence neither celebrated nor mourned. He became a lesson rather than a presence, a chapter closed without revision. Amelia did not frame her future as recovery from betrayal, but as construction built on clarity. As she held her children, feeling the quiet weight of responsibility settle fully into place, she understood that new beginnings are rarely loud. They are forged through resolve, sustained by boundaries, and strengthened by the courage to choose forward motion without regret. In that understanding, Amelia stepped fully into a life no longer defined by survival, but by purpose earned and peace maintained. Thank you for listening to Luxurious Tales. If this tale moved you, share it with someone, leave a comment, and let us know what you felt. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Until next time.